So, we have spoken about GDP and GNP, and we have spoken about unemployment as indicators of macroeconomic status. Today, we are going to talk about the demand and supply model. Now, we have already spoken about the demand and supply model, but I want to remind you that that was in a micro context. So, today we are going to talk about the demand and supply model from a macro perspective, that is from the perspective of the entire economy. So, today we are covering the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply model. Now, aggregate demand is also called AD and aggregate supply is called AS. So, we are going to talk about AD and AS model today. Now, just like we did earlier from the micro's perspective, we spoke about demand, then we spoke about supply, and finally we brought the two sides together. Similarly, here we are going to talk about aggregate demand, then we are going to talk about aggregate supply, and finally we are going to bring the two together. Now, you must remember very clearly that here we are talking about demand and supply from the macroeconomics perspective, not from the micro perspective. So, that means, what does that mean basically? It means that we are no longer looking at the market for one particular good. So, if I digress and just refresh your memory about micro, so in microeconomics we were looking at the quantity and price relationship for a particular good. So, let us say this was apples. So, on the y axis we had the dollar price of apples. So, we had dollars here, and here we had quantity in units of apples. So, maybe pounds, whatever units apples are measured in. It could be, one apple, two apples, or it could be 1 pound, 5 pounds, or whatever, right. So, pounds, let us say, and we had the demand for 3 different individuals. So, let us say Joe, Jack and John, right, and we said both of them, all 3 of them, sorry, would have an inverse relationship between price and quantity due to the law of demand. So, all 3 of them would have downward sloping demand curves, right, and these demand curves, let us call them D1, D2 and D3. So, these demand curves D1, D2, D3 would be the individual demand curves for the good apples for these 3 individuals. So, D1 is Joe's demand curve for apples, D2 is for Jack and D3 is for John. So, that is their individual demand curves. And then we had said that if we horizontally sum these up, and I am not going into the details of horizontal summation because I already did in the demand supply chapter, you can go back and take a look at that. But if we horizontally sum D1, D2 and D3, then we end up getting another downward sloping demand curve, and that downward sloping demand curve is still the demand curve for the commodity apples, but that demand curve, let us call it DM, is basically the market demand curve for apples. So, what is noteworthy here is that we are still talking about the demand for apples, right. So, we are just talking about the demand for one commodity, and so it is micro in that sense. And when we look at the market demand curve DM, the market demand curve is basically a horizontal summation of the individual demand curves. In other words, DM shows you the demand for apples for all individuals who buy apples in the market, right. So, this apples, the fact that we are looking at one commodity, that is important. And the fact that we are measuring price, a dollar value on the y-axis, that is also important for you to remember here. Now, as we move away from micro to macro, this is going to change. Now, in macro, we are no longer concerned about the market for one commodity. Rather, we are concerned about all goods and services produced in this economy. So, we are treating this entire economy like a single entity, like a single market, and we are considering all goods and services that are sold, bought and sold in this economy as the commodity. So, we are kind of broadening the picture, and instead of picking one market and one commodity, we are treating the whole economy as a marketplace and all goods and services as a single entity, as a clumped entity which is being bought and sold in this economy. Okay? So, if I draw the same demand curve for the macro economy, obviously I cannot put the name of the market, I cannot put the name of the commodity here, because like I told you, we are not picking out a single commodity. We are considering all goods and services that are produced and bought and sold in this economy, right? Similarly, I would not know what to put on the y-axis because I cannot single out the dollar price of one commodity, right? I could not put the dollar price of apples here, or I could not put the dollar price of spa services here, or I could not put the dollar price of corn here. I wouldn't know which dollar value to put here. So, that means I need something to put on the y-axis which is an indicator or representative value for prices of all goods and services in the economy. So, what needs to go there is something that would indicate the prices of all goods and services in the economy. Now, if I do not know if that rings a bell, but when I say that I am looking at the indicator for prices of all goods and services, that kind of tells you that we are looking for an index, right. So, we are basically looking for an index of the prices of goods and services in the economy. In other words, we are basically going to put the average prices of goods and services in the economy, which is basically an indicator. Now, earlier we have spoken about a similar indicator. If we remember, we spoke about the GDP deflator, and we said the GDP deflator was a price index and it was an indicator of the average prices in the economy. So, what goes here on the y-axis is capital P. Now, please note that this capital P is not a dollar value. It is just a number. It is a real number because it is an index, and an index is never in terms of dollars. It is not the price of one particular commodity, but it is the indicator of the average prices of all goods and services bought and sold in the economy. So, that is the main difference between the microeconomics demand and supply model and the macroeconomic demand and supply model. Now, what about the x-axis? Once again, on the x-axis, we cannot put the quantity of one particular good, because once again we are treating all goods and services. So, that means I need to put the quantity of all goods and services that are produced and bought and sold in the market, right. So, now that seems to be similar to the definition of GDP, because remember we said that GDP was the total value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a year. So, that means what goes there is once again not a quantity of a commodity, but the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy. So, you have real GDP here. Now, real GDP, because you know that is the one that adjusts for prices over time. So, real GDP, which is denoted by a capital Y. Now, please note this x-axis is in terms of dollars, because you know that real GDP is measured in terms of dollars, whereas in microeconomics the x-axis was not in terms of dollars, it was in terms of real units of a commodity, right, pounds or 5 baskets or 10 dozens, whatever. It had to be a unit of quantity, but here the unit is in terms of dollars. So please be aware about these basic differences in the microeconomic and the macroeconomic demand and supply model. The first difference is, in microeconomics it was a single commodity. Here we are treating all goods and services taken together. In microeconomics, the y-axis was a dollar value. It was the own price of the commodity. Here it is the indicator of average prices of all goods and services. So basically the GDP deflator. And in microeconomics, on the x-axis you had quantity and the units were in terms of some units of quantity. And in macroeconomics you have real GDP on the x-axis, which is in terms of dollars. Now, the same law of demand also holds in macroeconomics. That means as prices in the economy are higher, the real GDP tends to be lower, and as the prices in the economy are lower, the real GDP tends to be higher. So that means even if we draw the demand curve for the macroeconomy, that demand curve is downward sloping, and that demand curve is basically called the aggregate demand curve or AD curve, right. Now, at high levels of prices, the real GDP is low, and at lower value of prices, the real GDP is high. So, if it is P1, let us say the price level, the real GDP is Y1. If it rises to P2, then the real GDP falls to Y2. So, there is an inverse relationship. Now, this increase in prices, please note, this is not referring to the increase in price of a particular commodity, but it is talking about the increase in the general price level of the economy. That means your economy in general has become more expensive. So, this increase in price is basically inflation in the economy. We are talking about inflation, where inflation is a situation of rising prices in the economy. It is a situation of rising prices, and the opposite of inflation would be deflation. So, if the price level goes down in the economy, if your economy becomes cheaper over time, then you call that deflation. So, deflation is the opposite of inflation. It is a situation of falling prices in the economy. It is a situation of falling prices in the economy. So, we are saying that if there is inflation, then there is a decrease in the real GDP. Now, this decrease in the real GDP is also known as stagnation. Okay, so whenever there is inflation, there is stagnation in the economy. Now, if we consider the opposite direction, if we consider the fall in prices, if we said that price went down from P2 to P1, then you would see that your real GDP increases from Y2 to Y1, right. If you consider the opposite direction, if you went from P2 to P1, then basically your real GDP is increasing from Y2 to Y1. But in that case, the fall in prices would be called deflation, like we just said, and the increase in the real GDP, that is basically called growth. Okay. So, we can say that given the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, given that law of demand holds at the macro level, we can say that inflation would lead to stagnation and deflation would cause growth given everything else in the economy stays the same. That means given ceteris paribus. Okay, everything else in the economy staying the same, inflation would cause stagnation and deflation would cause growth in the economy. Now, we are getting that relationship because the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. But what really leads to this downward sloping aggregate demand curve? Or in other words, why do we see this inverse relationship between P and real GDP? Why do we see this inverse relationship between the price index and real GDP? So what defines this inverse relationship? That is the question that we must answer. Now to understand that, let's go into some details. To understand the working of this, to understand the mechanism of this downward sloping demand curve, we must understand first what is this demand curve, what are the points on this demand curve, what are we really talking about, okay? What is one point on this demand curve, what does that signify, okay? So what is the meaning of this point, what is the meaning of that point, okay? So that is the question that we must answer first. Now any point on the aggregate demand curve is basically the total expenditure on goods and services. Please note carefully that any point, and let's name these points A, B, C. So points like A, B, C, and there could be numerous such points on that aggregate demand curve. So all those points basically represent the total expenditure of the economy at that particular price index. So basically if I am talking about point A, then I am saying that point A is the total expenditure of the economy when the price index is P1. Okay. So A is the total expenditure of the economy, let's call that TE1. So it's the total expenditure of the economy when the price index for the economy is P1. Okay. Similarly, B is the total expenditure for the economy when the price index is P2. Okay. Let's call that TE2. That's the total expenditure. So TE is for total expenditure. Similarly, point C, C is the total expenditure of the economy when the price index is P3 or TE3. So each point is basically representing the total expenditure, and you can see that as the price indices go down, that means as the price level in the economy falls, the total expenditure in the economy is actually rising, right? So that means what really defines this inverse relationship between real GDP and the price index is the total expenditure. In other words, I am saying that as price index falls, the total expenditure rises, and as a result of that, the real GDP rises in the economy. So what basically fills the gap is the total expenditure of the economy. As price index falls, total expenditure rises, so real GDP rises. Similarly, if price index would rise, then total expenditure would fall, and as a result of that, real GDP would fall. So it is total expenditure that is basically driving the rise or fall in real GDP. Now why is that the case? What is this total expenditure? Now total expenditure is the expenditure or the spending of the entire economy on goods and services. Okay? So it is what the whole economy spends on goods and services. Now go back to your 4-sector circular flow model. Try to refresh your memory. Who are the people who spend on goods and services in the economy? Of course, the household sector, right? All American citizens and households, the household sector, they spend on goods and services. Their spending is called consumption expenditure, if you remember, capital C, right? Also, the government spends on goods and services, and the spending of the government is known as government expenditure, so capital G. The firms spend on goods and services, so their spending is called the investment expenditure, which is capital I. The rest of the world also spends on our goods and services. So the foreign sector also spends on our goods and services, and their expenditure is called capital X. So basically the total expenditure is C plus I plus G plus X, but remember, some of this expenditure is also being made on goods that came from rest of the world into our country. So some of that expenditure is also on imported goods. So we need to subtract the imports right there, x minus m. So basically what you see here is total expenditure actually leads you to the formula that you really had for GDP. So we know that this total expenditure is actually identically the same as the GDP of the country or the real GDP of the country, okay, whatever you want to call it. So, and that is the reason that we are saying that whatever happens to total expenditure actually drives the same change on real GDP. Okay. So, total expenditure is what driving the inverse relationship between price index and real GDP. Now, the next question is, why should total expenditure react in that way, right? How do we know that if price index goes up, if there is inflation in the country, then total expenditure must go down, and if the price index goes down, that means there is deflation in the country, total expenditure should go up. Who tells me that? How do I get that relationship, right? Let's delve deep into that part. Let's look at why we have that inverse relationship between price index and total expenditure. So we are going to understand why we have this inverse relationship between the price index and the total expenditure, that is, as price index goes up, total expenditure goes down, as price index goes down, total expenditure goes up. Why do I have this relationship? Now this relationship is valid. Now once again, ceteris paribus is of course there, right? Everything else in the economy is staying the same. That is still important. It's always important in economics. It's a very important assumption that nothing else is changing, because something else changes in the system, then that entire logic goes kaput. Okay. So let's kind of understand why we have this inverse relationship. Now, if prices go up, then the purchasing power of money in an economy really goes down. For example, what am I trying to say? Let's say you have a $10 bill in your pocket, okay, and you walk into McDonald's with that $10 bill and you ask the price of a Big Mac, and they say that, okay, a Big Mac is $2. Each Big Mac is $2. That means you have the capacity or the purchasing power of 5 Big Macs right now, right? Because you have $10 in your pocket, so that green paper can buy you 5 Big Macs, real Big Macs, 5, right? Tomorrow you go into the same store, or maybe you go into the same store next month with that same $10 bill, right? That same piece of green paper, and you ask what is the price of a Big Mac, and they now tell you that the prices have gone up and the Big Mac is now $5. Each Big Mac is $5. Now please note, nothing else has changed in the economy. You have the same amount of money in your pocket, the same $10 bill, but what has changed as a result of the rise in prices is the basket of Big Macs that you can buy. Earlier you could buy a basket that had 5 Big Macs. Now you can buy a basket that only has 2 Big Macs. So what has changed is the purchasing power of money, right? So if this is true, as prices go up, if the purchasing power of money comes down, then please note that the total expenditure gets affected, and as a result of that, the real GDP in the economy gets affected, because the actual basket of goods and services that are produced and that are actually bought and sold has come down. Earlier there were 5 Big Macs that were being transacted, now there are only 2 Big Macs that are getting transacted. So basically it is the purchasing power of money that has affected the real GDP of the economy. Now this is also called, what we just discussed is also called the real balance effect. So the real balance effect is the effect on the purchasing power of money due to inflation or deflation, and hence an effect on the total basket of goods and services that you can buy, which further leads to an impact on the real GDP, right? So the first explanation for this inverse relationship is the real balance effect, okay? The second explanation for this inverse relationship is the wealth effect. The wealth effect. Now, whenever there is inflation or deflation in the economy, the value of assets go up or down, right? If there is inflation, then the value of the assets tend to fall, and if there is deflation, then the value of the assets tend to rise. Now, the assets could be in the form of money, or it could be in the form of non-monetary wealth also. For example, you might have a lot like a yard, or you might have like a house, or you might have like let's say jewelry, or you could have like some precious furniture or whatever, right? So, it could be in the form of non-monetary wealth. Whenever the prices in the economy goes up, the value of these assets go down, right? Because now if you sell these assets, you will probably get the same amount of money, but that money will be able to buy you less amount of goods and services, right? So, maybe you have a house and the house is worth $100,000, okay? Now, the prices in the economy have gone up. So, you have inflation in the economy. You sell this $100,000 house and you get whatever money. Now, this money is able to buy you less goods and services now that the prices have gone up in the economy than at a time when the prices were lower, right? You often have heard your parents or your grandparents say this, right? We could buy so much with so little earlier. So, they are basically talking about the wealth effect, the fact that the value of assets have gone down because of inflation. Now, once again, please remember the wealth could be monetary or non-monetary wealth. Okay. So, it is the wealth effect that really affects the total expenditure and hence the real GDP, because as prices go up, the value of the assets go down, and hence the total volume of goods and services that are transacted in the economy go down. Okay. So, these two effects basically explain the inverse relationship between the price index and total expenditure, and hence that explains the inverse relationship between price index and real GDP, because I told you that total expenditure kind of lies in the middle. That is what kind of connects real GDP and the price index. So, whatever relationship you have for total expenditure will be true for real GDP as well. And due to this inverse relationship, we have the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So, that is where we started. We were trying to answer the question why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So, now we have answered that question. The answer lies here in these two effects. These two effects basically lead to that inverse relationship, and this inverse relationship is responsible for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Now, next we are going to talk about the shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Okay? That is the second part we are going to cover today. So, now we are going to talk about the shifts of the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand shifters. Now, please note that the real balance effect and the wealth effect do not shift the aggregate demand curve, because the real balance effect and the wealth effect are talking about inflation or deflation and what happens in response to inflation or deflation. So, basically for the wealth effect and the real balance effect, we are essentially talking about a change in the y-axis here, an increase or decrease in the y-axis, right. So, that means we are talking about a movement up or down along the AD curve. We are not talking about a shift of the AD curve. Once again, if you have to understand the difference between a movement and a shift, it might be a good idea to go back and watch the video on demand and supply model under the microeconomics part, okay, you will understand what I'm talking about. So whenever you have a change on the y-axis, you really do not have a shift of the curve. What you have is a movement along the curve. So the real balance effect and the wealth effect are essentially talking about a movement along the eddy curve. So we are not talking about real balance effect or wealth effect. We are talking about some other factors that can shift the eddy curve, and they shift the eddy curve with the price index in the economy being constant. So now we are not saying that there is inflation or deflation in the economy. Instead, we are saying that the price index in the economy is stationary and something else is changing in the economy, so that you have a change in the aggregate demand. So such a change will cause a shift of the aggregate demand, and the first factor in that direction is called the interest rate effect. Okay, the interest rate effect. What is the interest rate effect? So the interest rate effect is saying what happens to aggregate demand if the rate of interest in the economy changes at the same price index. No change in the price index, given the same price index, so no inflation or deflation. If the rate of interest goes up or down, then what really happens to the aggregate demand? Now, for simplicity, let us assume that there is just one rate of interest in the economy, and that rate of interest is given by small r. Okay? So that is the rate of interest in the economy. Now let's see what happens if rate of interest goes up. If there is an increase in the rate of interest, then two things can happen. Please note, and please listen to this carefully. This is one important part of the chapter. If rate of interest goes up, then from the perspective of the business firms, taking loans becomes difficult for them, right? Because rate of interest has gone up. So if they take loans, they have to pay higher rate of interest when they return the loans. So they have to pay a higher rate of interest to the banks. So this works as a disincentive for business firms to take loans. And if business firms cannot take loans, then they cannot make investments, right? So basically, this increase in the rate of interest leads to a decrease in investment spending of the business firms. Okay, that's the first impact, that the business firms do not take loans. They have a disincentive for taking loans. If they do not take loans, then they cannot make as much investment, so the investment spending of the business firms go down. Now, please note that rate of interest is also what you earn when you and me, we put our money into some investment tools. For example, if we keep our money in savings account, or if we put our money into bonds or stocks, right? That is the rate return that we get. Remember, I told you, for simplicity, we are assuming that there is only one rate of interest in the economy. Usually in the real world, these rate of interest would be different, but here we are assuming that there is the same rate, one rate of interest, which is R. So this rate of interest is also the return that you earn when you put your money into something. By something, I mean some investment, some kind of investment. It could be a certificate deposit, it could be a savings account at a bank, it could be bonds. So it is the return that you earn. Now, if that return is high, if you have a chance of earning a higher return or a higher rate of interest, if you put your money in a savings account, what would you do? You would put more and more money in your savings account. So it works as an incentive for you to put your money in the bank. And as that happens, as you save more and you put more money in the banks into investments, you are able to consume less. So for the households, there is a decrease in consumption because now they have an incentive to save. Remember what I said? When your income comes in, you do three things out of it. You pay taxes, you consume, and you save, right? So there is no change in taxes, right? You have to pay the same taxes. And if you save more, then you have to consume less, correct? Now these two things taken together, the decrease in investment spending and the decrease in consumption spending, is going to decrease the total expenditure TE of the economy, because remember what was TE? TE was C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? That is your TE. So C and G coming down with everything else staying the same in the economy would take your TE down. So as TE comes down with no change in the price index, the aggregate demand comes down, and by this decrease in aggregate demand, we are not referring to a movement, but we are talking about a shift, and a shift in the leftward direction, because now you know that whenever there is a decrease, there is a left shift of the demand curve. Whenever there is an increase, there is a right shift of the demand curve. You know that from your microeconomics part. If you do not remember that part, once again it might be good idea to go back and watch that video and kind of understand better what I am talking about. So if I draw the diagram, you have real GDP here, you have your price index there, and you have your aggregate demand curve. So let's say this is the initial price index P1. So what I am really saying is, due to this increase in rate of interest and all of this interest rate effect taking place, your aggregate demand goes down, right? So no change in the price index. There is no change in the price index. At the same price index, just because the rate of interest went up, you have the interest rate effect, so that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left to AD dash, and you have a new total expenditure, right? And as a result of that, you have a new GDP in the economy, where that new real GDP Y2 is less than the original real GDP Y1. So your real GDP has gone down. Okay, that is what we are talking about. There is no inflation or deflation taking place here directly, but what has happened is an increase in the rate of interest in the economy, which has caused the decrease in aggregate demand, and hence it has caused stagnation in the economy. By stagnation, I mean the decrease in real GDP. Okay. Now, if rate of interest went up, if there was a decrease in the rate of interest, if rate of interest went down, then the opposite would happen, right? If rate of interest is going down, then business firms now find it easier to take loans, because they have to pay back less in terms of interest. So they will take more loans. As they take more loans, they will be able to invest more. So the investment spending will be higher. For households, now they do not get enough return on their savings, so they don't want to make more savings. Instead, they would prefer to consume. So consumption would be higher, and those two taken together, the total expenditure of the economy would be higher, and as total expenditure is higher, you would see that the aggregate demand curve increases, aggregate demand curve shifts right, because the aggregate demand of the economy increases, right. So now we are talking about a right shift. Once again, it's the same price index, no change in the price index. Just because the rate of interest went down, you now have a aggregate demand curve AD double dash, and you have a higher real GDP Y3, where Y3 is greater than Y1. So there has been growth in the economy due to the decrease in the rate of interest, right. So the two sides that I have explained, this is basically interest rate effect, and this is one of the factors that shifts the aggregate demand curve. Okay. Now the next factor which causes a shift of the aggregate demand curve is called expectations effect. It's called the expectations effect. And when I say expectations, I am referring to expectations of the consumers as well as the expectations of the producers. Now, what are these expectations about? It is the expectations of the consumers and the producers about the state of the economy, about what kind of an economy, what kind of a country they are living in. Now, if the consumers and producers are really happy about the current state of the economy, how the economy is being run, whether there is political stability, whether there is, the banking sector is performing well. So, if there are good things happening in the economy, then the consumers and producers feel extremely hopeful about the economy. They feel positive about the economy. In other words, there is optimism in the economy, right? Optimism. So, if all good things are happening in the economy, and by good things it means socio-political and financial. So, if there is political stability, the government is bringing up good policies that are conducive for the households and the business firms, then the consumers and the producers feel good about the economy, feel positive about the economy, and they show a lot of optimism. Now, whenever there is an environment of optimism in the economy, usually the consumption is high, because people do think that, okay, it is fine not to save because my country is doing well. So, it's okay to spend on goods and services. I don't need to save for rainy days. And the business firms are also encouraged to invest more because the economy is doing good. So, whenever there is optimism, there is higher consumption expenditure, there is higher investment expenditure, and usually also higher government expenditure, and as a result of that, the total expenditure of the economy is higher. Once again, due to that, the aggregate demand in the economy is higher. So, you see a right shift of the aggregate demand curve. Please note once again, nothing has happened to the price index. So, there is no inflation or deflation in the economy, but just because there is an air of optimism in the economy due to the macroeconomic status of the country, there is a higher total expenditure which takes the aggregate demand curve to the right, and as a result the real GDP of the country also increases and there is growth in the country. Now, opposite would happen if there is an environment of pessimism. So, if there is some kind of crisis in the economy, and that crisis could once again be socio-political or economic crisis, but if people are not feeling positive, if they have a negative environment, so let's say there is political corruption in the country, rampant corruption, the government is not bringing policies that is helpful for business firms, or there is a lot of instability in the financial market, there is financial crisis, the stock market has collapsed, things like that do not make people in general very positive about their country. It makes them feel negative, and whenever there is a negative feeling, people become defensive, right? So, they think that, okay, the country is not doing good, so I need to save up. I need to save up. Okay? It's just like how you feel before your exams. If you did well on the previous exam, then you think, oh, this subject is really easy, I have done well on the exam, so it's okay if I do not study. Okay? But if you have done bad on the exam, then you think, oh, this is a hard subject, I really need to push and I need to kind of put in more hours in studying so that I do better next time. So, the same thing. If the economy is not doing good, then people try harder to kind of save up so that they do not run into problems. So, as a result of that, under pessimism, consumption is lower and investment is lower, and usually government expenditure is lower. So, as a result of that, the total expenditure of the country comes down, and hence aggregate demand for the country comes down. Once again, note that we are not talking about inflation or deflation here. So, the price index or the y-axis of your diagram is still constant, and you just see a shift of the aggregate demand curve. As the aggregate demand comes down, the real GDP also comes down and you get stagnation in the economy. So, we can say that optimism leads to growth and pessimism leads to stagnation by a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the right or to the left in respectively in the two cases. Okay. Now, the third and final reason for the shift of the aggregate demand curve that we will discuss is the foreign income effect. So, the foreign income effect. Okay. So the foreign income effect basically talks about what happens to the real GDP of your country, what happens to the aggregate demand and the real GDP of your country due to a change in the income of people living outside your country, change in the income of foreigners. Now for a country like United States, almost every other country is our trade partner, right? So they trade with us. US goods are exported to most countries, and some of them are really big trade partners, right? A lot of goods and services from the US go to those countries. Now if there is a change in income in one of those major trade partnering countries, then what would happen? If the income goes up in those countries, let's say in country X, okay, so the income goes up in country X, so the people living in country X, they have higher income, so obviously they will buy more goods and services, right, because now they are earning more. Now as they buy more goods and services, they will buy some goods that are produced within their own country, that is produced in X, but at the same time they will also buy some goods that are exported by USA. That means they will buy some goods that came into their country from USA, right? Remember, this is all happening in a foreign country, right? So people in X are earning more, they are buying more, but as they buy more, they are not only buying goods that were produced in X, but they also buy more of the goods that went from USA to country X, right? So what we see sitting here in USA is basically a boost in our exports. If foreign income rises, then we see a boost in our exports because people want more of our goods, they are buying more of our goods. So our exports go up, and as our exports go up, our total expenditure also goes up, because remember, total expenditure is C plus I plus G plus X, right? So as X goes up with no other change, the total expenditure goes up. As a result of that, your aggregate demand goes up, and you see a right shift of the aggregate demand curve. Once again, please note that nothing has happened to the price index. There is no inflation or deflation. But because of change in income of people in a foreign country, you see a change in the aggregate demand or a shift of the aggregate demand in the home country in USA, as a result of which US real GDP would rise, right? Same thing. US real GDP would rise, so you see growth in USA, right? Real GDP is rising. The opposite would happen if the foreign income goes down. If people don't earn enough, they are not going to buy goods and services, so they also don't buy enough of our goods and services, so our exports will go down. As our exports go down, our total expenditure goes down. As total expenditure goes down, the aggregate demand goes down and real GDP goes down. So, you have stagnation in the country. So, what happens in another country could impact the home country also, right? So, as I wrap up this part on aggregate demand, please note that the slope of the aggregate demand curve is defined by the real balance effect and the wealth effect. So, those two effects are really talking about what happens to aggregate demand and what happens to real GDP due to inflation or deflation. So, those are talking about movements along the aggregate demand curve, but these three effects, the interest rate effect, the expectations effect and the foreign income effect, are talking about what happens to real GDP and what happens to aggregate demand when something other than the price index changes, when something else happens in the economy other than inflation or deflation. So, these are talking about the shifts of the aggregate demand curve. Now, at the very end, you must remember that as aggregate demand goes up, that means as you have a right shift of the aggregate demand curve, your real GDP rises and you have growth in the economy, and as you have a left shift of the aggregate demand curve, your real GDP goes down or you have stagnation in the economy. Now this increase in aggregate demand or the right shift is also called a positive demand shock, a positive demand shock, and the left shift of the aggregate demand or a fall in the real GDP, that's called a negative demand shock. Now we will come back to positive and negative demand shock later again after we have covered the supply part, but we will stop here today and next time we will come back to the aggregate supply part.